corrections of gamma. That was the your third assignment. Before I start the corrections, I want to remind you of how a balance sheet of a typical U.S. depository institution looks like. So let's use the name of this institution as ABC Depository Bank. All right, and what we're looking at is a balance sheet. Okay, so on the left side we have the assets of a depository institution, and on the asset side we have reserves, which are partly required and partly excess, and then we have loans, or loans capacity of a depository institution. And at the very bottom we have the totals, which we label as total assets. On the right side of the balance sheet we have liabilities. Okay, and we're primarily looking at this liability account called deposits. And at the very bottom of the liabilities column we have total liabilities. All right. All right. Well, you already know this. I went over this stuff when I was talking about monetary policy. This is just a review. Okay, so let me draw this line here. Let's come back to the asset side. Excess reserves plus required reserves is equal to total reserves. And then total reserves plus loans is equal to total assets. Quicker this time. Excess reserves plus required reserves is equal to total reserves, and then total reserves plus loans is equal to total assets. Well, on the liability side, well, there are not that many entries, right? There's only one entry there, and that's deposits. Obviously, this is a much streamlined balance sheet, but that's all we need for understanding how monetary policy works. So you remember my example in a previous presentation. We had deposits of 100, which meant that total liabilities are 100, which means that total assets must also be 100. And I think what we said was that the central bank was in charge of setting up the minimum reserve requirement ratio, decided on 5%, or more precisely 0.05, and not 0.5. 0.5 would be 50%. Here we're talking about 5%. All right, so the way we started this was to say that excess reserves are 0, and now comes the calculation part, which is not that difficult. What are required reserves? Well, to get required reserves, MRRR, we take the MRRR, which has been given to us in this exercise, right? 5% times D. And what's D? Well, that's deposits. So 5% times deposits of 100 gives us required reserves of 5. And then in turn, excess reserves, 0, plus required reserves, 5, gives us total reserves of 5. And to complete the asset side, well, if a bank has deposits of $100 million and it has to hold back as required reserves $5 million, that's because the central bank is telling them to do so, then the question becomes, how large is the loan's capacity? Well, 95. Loans, 95, plus required reserves, plus total reserves of 5 is equal to total assets of 100. Whoops. Of 100, and then in turn, total assets are equal to total liabilities. 100 is equal to 100. So once again, on the asset side, loans 95 plus total reserves of 5 is equal to total assets of 100, and that squares out with total liabilities on the liability side. Okay, so I think that's all you need to know to complete to deal with question 1 of the Gamma assignment. Okay, question 1, whoops, a little bit too thick. Question 1A. So we were supposed to use this information here. Deposits 600 million, excess reserves 20, and loans 560. And what we have to calculate are the required reserves. Okay, so let's do this. First, the asset side. We have R, reserves, which are required reserves, and excess reserves, and loans. All right. So on the asset side, ER, excess reserves, plus RR, required reserves, is equal to R, total reserves. And then in turn, total reserves plus loans is equal to TA. That's total assets. On the liability side, well, we only have one entry there, and that's deposits. So deposits are equal to total liabilities. Now, let me switch colors. So what are we told? We're told, first of all, that deposits are 600. Deposits are 600, which means that total liabilities are 600, which means that total assets will be 600. We're also told that excess reserves are 20. And we're told that loans are 560. All right. So again, we're after the required reserves. Well, let's see. If total assets are 600, if loans are 560, then R, which represents total reserves, must be equal to 40. And if total reserves are 40 and excess reserves are 20, then required reserves must be 20. Okay, so what's the answer? Required reserves are 20. Nextly, 1b. I think we've already done it. Let me do it again, just to reinforce it. Plus I have nothing else to do. So, on the asset side, we have R, that refers to total reserves. Below that we have RR, required reserves, and below that we have excess reserves, ER, and then we have the loans capacity. And below that we have TA, total assets. On the liability side, we have deposits, which is the only liability account, and that gives us total liabilities. Once again, we're told that deposits are 600, which means that total liabilities is 600, which means that total assets is, or must be, equal to 600. We're also told that excess reserves is 20, and we're told that loans is 560. So once again, if we know that total assets are 600, if we're told that loans are 560, then we figure out that total reserves are equal to 40. All right? And from that, we can also figure out that required reserves are 20. But in 1b, the question is, calculate total reserves. So total reserves are 40. They are the addition of required reserves and excess reserves, which gives us 40, and then in turn, our total reserves plus loans of 560 is equal to total assets of 600. This is question 1c. And what we're asked to do is to calculate the minimum reserve requirement ratio. Again, the question reads, calculate. Calculate from where? From the given here. I'm only reinforcing this because a lot of you said that the minimum reserve requirement ratio is 5%, that it's a given and it's true throughout. Well, that's not the gist of the question. The question is, given this information here, calculate the central bank's minimum reserve requirement ratio. So let me proceed. How do we do that? MRRR, minimum reserve requirement ratio, is equal to RR, that's required reserves, divided by D, that's deposits, times 100. Because we want a percent, right? The minimum reserve requirement ratio is a percent. So what are required reserves? We calculated them to be 20. What are deposits? 600. We multiplied this by 100, and we get a minimum reserve requirement ratio of 3.33%. All right? Or 0.0333. Question 1D. If ABC Bank receives a new deposit of $1,000, and not millions, $1,000, how much would the bank have to retain or hold back as new required reserves? How much could it not loan out, in other words? Well, we take the $1,000 deposit and we multiply it times the MRRR, which is 3.33%, which is stated this way, 0.0333. Okay, again, this is the MRRR, which we calculated in C, and this is the new deposit. And the question is, how much is the bank forced by the central bank to hold back, to retain, not to loan out to its customers? The answer is $33.30. 1E. If ABC Bank receives a new deposit of $1,000, again, not millions, how much could it loan out to its customers? So, question 1C, 1D, and 1E are related. They are obviously linked. So, this new depositor, or an old depositor, deposited $1,000. Given the MRRR of 3.33%, the depository institution has to hold back, not loan out, retain $33.30. So what's left for the bank to loan out of these $1,000? $966.70. So out of this new deposit of $1,000, our bank has to retain $33.30, and it can loan out $966.70. Questions 2 and 3, they are pretty much the same question. How have the two central banks, the Fed, the American Central Bank, and the ECB, the European Central Bank, how have they started to deal with the economic effects of the coronavirus pandemic? Well, most of you answered that correctly, that central banks have started on a mass scale to inject into the economies a tremendous amount of liquidity. In other words, both central banks, the Fed and the ECB, are practicing expansionary monetary policy. Well, I mean, there are some oddities, and it's mostly evident in the United States, where it appears as if a lot of this money is going not where it's supposed to. Well, that's a progressive argument. In other words, just like with the subprime crises of 2008, 2009, 2010, the U.S. government, the U.S. Central Bank, well, they had, they had an option, either to help Main Street, And the term Main Street means, well, the middle class, your every Joe. Or Wall Street. Wall Street. The term Wall Street means the financial markets. Okay, so as history points out, in the U.S. and later in the Eurozone, your average Joe, in other words, mainstream, was not really helped out by expansionary monetary policy. Most of the paths were towards feeding more money to Wall Street. All right, so in essence, that's what I was looking for. With some of you, I mean, questions 2 and 3, some of you attempted to answer it in 2 or 3 sentences. I'm afraid 2 or 3 sentences will not do it. I mean, I didn't want a doctoral dissertation here, but you know, to answer question 2 or question 3 in fewer than, let's say, 5, 6 sentences, well, it just will not do. So with subsequent essay questions, please put some meat on the bone. Put some meat on the bone. Don't be afraid to write. Don't plagiarize. I've caught some of you. All right. All right. So let me write these words of wisdom. Yeah. The end. Well, the end of this section. There's more coming.